His great grandfather's which is actually
Yeah, that was the first challenge.
Oh yeah, that's right. He was saying that that's all of James. I don't have the last name. James. I'm very disappointed it's just a James. In my I think the last lecture was the other notebook. Because I only have 2 notebooks.
And y'all don't have to stop talking just because you're in here. You can kind of carry on the social vibe of the reception as we're all getting seated. It just takes a while
the grayer one. I think that's 2.
Get everyone in.
Like the grayish blue one. Yeah. It's in his pocket.
Lately, we've kept it over here, though. I think this is kind of the new happy place for the podium. Give it to me. Yes, Terry, it's for you.
Oh yeah. Which one's your biggest? Oh, if we're talking about pure filmmaking, if we're talking about this is I'm not even considering historicity because neither of them. In terms of how, in terms of icons and
Like an American ask his ranger how are you?
it's from like a newspaper like 50 years after he died. So over 50 years after he died. Yeah, wasn't it a copy of the original? Can you see right here?
Yes.
Right there. Get some art out to it. At least you got the white man.
Back inside.
There's 2 there.
Seriously. Who's good? I know that's it's too late. What are they doing? They're giving out Israel propaganda.
Are you saving it for Alright, yeah. I think we're going to be...
First semester is really hard.
And we do still have...
What?
We still have... I think for those of you coming in, we do still have a few seats over here.
It's probably like, these are college students.
Yeah, but second semester was like a game changer. Yeah.
So for those of, oh, wow, that was scary. For those of you coming in, we do still have a few seats in the middle. And if you don't mind too much, some of you might scoot in just a little bit to make way for the late comers. Not really late, I shouldn't say it like that.
Sorry.
See what we've got. All right, this is great. I love seeing this theater packed. Okay, and it is 6 o'clock, so welcome everyone. I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Director of Educational Programs and Interpretation here at the American Civil War Museum. And this is the second lecture in our spring series, The Civil War and Remaking America, as we continue to explore the course of the war. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to mention that our final lecture in our spring series will take place on May 22nd, right here in this space. We'll have George Rabel speaking on the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and George B. McClellan. I think most of you, a lot of you here tonight are members. I know we have a lot of people with member tags. So I do want to say thank you to those of you who are our members. If you're not a member, consider becoming one, because not only would you get free admission to events like this, you will help us fulfill our mission to explore, inspire, and promote the public's understanding of the Civil War, its causes, course, and consequences. I also want to encourage everyone to come out this summer for our Wind Down Wednesdays that will be held on the last Wednesday of the month from June through August. You can join us for jazz, for food and drink, and we'll have the galleries open so that people can take advantage of those. And now for tonight's speaker, I am very honored to introduce a man who I think probably needs no introduction, William C. Davis. He is a retired history professor and former executive director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech University. An acclaimed expert on the Civil War, he has written numerous books and has served on a number of advisory boards, including the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, Civil War Preservation Trust, the Museum of the Civil War Soldier in Petersburg, Virginia, the National Park Service, and the Lincoln Prize and Pulitzer nominating juries. So let's give Dr. William C. Jack Davis a warm welcome.
Am I on? Yep, nope.
No?
How about now?
No?
We're getting there.
Can you hear me without this? Well, I'll go ahead and get started. I'll yell a little bit. It'll make my wife happy. She won't be able to hear me when I get home.
There you go. There you go.
Thanks very much for the gracious introduction, Kelly, and thanks to all of you for having me down here. For years I have made it a policy that there are two groups to whom I have never said no. One is the National Park Service, and the other was the old Museum of the Confederacy, now the American Civil War Museum. I think our visitors get more bang for their buck in interpretation and information from those two organizations than anywhere else in the country. So I compliment all of you for being supporters of this magnificent institution. It is slightly more magnificent now than it was a year ago because it has something of mine in it. My great-great-grandfather, William Dobson Hutchins of the 11th Missouri Cavalry, whom I know you have all heard of, left behind his soldier's stencil with his name and unit and his pistol cartridge case, which are now somewhere here in the collections of the museum. Line up somewhere outside and I'm sure you can get a tour of the pocket mine. Kelly mentioned that George Rabel will be coming for the next lecture in this series. I had just heard George's talk on McClellan and Lincoln about 3 weeks ago. I'll give you a little hint. George has a cat. Guess what it's named? McClellan. It's afraid of mice. It's a great talk, very illuminating, and a lot more fair to McClellan than he tends to get. I don't know how much fairness he deserves, but he will get some from Georgia. And it's pretty insightful on that commander-in-chief, general-in-chief relationship that is so important in any time of conflict, whether it's then or now. Without a good relationship between these two individuals, the whole military hierarchy, the military system, down to the soldier level, is going to be in some way impacted. If they're not simpatico, if they're not in tune, how can they carry out whatever grand enterprise it is that's entrusted to them? Lincoln and McClellan is a wonderful example of a command relationship that didn't work very well. I'll be talking to you tonight about a different kind of command relationship that I think on balance worked very well, given the constraints and the circumstances at hand. It will be no surprise to any of you that Jefferson Davis had a somewhat tumultuous relationship with some of his Army commanders. Joseph E. Johnston, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Ain't tall enough for all that name. Kirby Smith, Braxton Bragg. I mean, John B. Hood, they're like characters out of The Wizard of Oz in some ways. The lion who needed courage, that's Johnston. The tin man who needed the heart, that's Beauregard. And the scarecrow who was just stupid, that's Hood. That's right. The next time you watch The Wizard of Oz, look at it with that in mind. Nothing bound Davis and Lee at the outset of the war. They virtually did not know each other. They come from two largely different cultures. Lee, of course, is an aristocrat, the old FFV in the Tidewater. Davis is one of the new men who were made out of the Western territories that became the state of Mississippi. They come from different backgrounds, different cultures. Davis's grandfather came from Wales. Lee's grandfather was probably here before Pocahontas. There was nothing in that to bind them together. They probably met, well, almost certainly they met when they were at West Point, but there is no reason to suspect there was any kind of interaction between them. Not a single source or letter survives indicating anything being done by Davis and Lee at the same time, or that they interacted with each other. And it's not likely that they would have. Davis is a year ahead of Lee. Davis in college, this will surprise many of you who know him only as president, as a college student at West Point, Davis was a frat boy. He was out for a good time. He was leaving the post constantly to go to Benny Haven's Tavern, which was off limits. He'll get arrested and court-martialed for drunkenness once. He'll be involved in a student rebellion when they tried to take over the campus. The 1960s were nothing to American colleges in the 1820s and 30s. One college in Kentucky, the students tried to kill the professor with a cannon. I've had thoughts like that from time to time. Lee, on the other hand, is the bluest blood of the FFV. He's an aristocrat. He may not be wealthy, he certainly is not, but he has the name and the lineage and a completely different personality and demeanor. It's highly unlikely that the two, I'm sure they had to have met, even though they're a year apart, but it's highly unlikely that there was any kind of personal relationship between them. Davis idolizes Albert Sidney Johnston, who's sort of the head cadet. Lee is in an entirely different echelon, an entirely different sort of clique of friends and associates. Davis, as I said, is kind of a frat boy. He graduates in 1828, 23rd in a class of 50. He's not a stellar student. And as a matter of fact, he's expelled once, and then they forgave him and allowed him to come back in. Lee, of course, graduates second in his class of about 40 in 1829. They both go into the old army. There's no evidence that they ever met. Lee spends most of his time in the old army before the war in the East, especially in these early years in Missouri, South Carolina, New York. Davis will spend his early time in the Northwest, what's now Minnesota, thereabouts. So they never crossed paths. In the war with Mexico, Davis is with Zach Taylor in the Mexican interior. Lee is with Winfield Scott, along the coast and heading up to Mexico City. So they never crossed paths. Their armies never crossed paths during the course of the war. So again, as far as we know, other than perhaps meeting at West Point, they had to be aware of each other. There's no evidence that there was ever any kind of interaction between them. And for this whole period, indeed, up to 1861, there was not a single known surviving letter between Davis and Lee. They knew of each other certainly, especially when they are two of the premier war heroes that come out of the conflict with Mexico. But there's nothing to indicate that, other than being aware of each other, that they ever had anything to do with each other. Come the 1850s, Davis, of course, becomes Secretary of War in 1853. And that's the same time when Lee is assigned to the superintendency of the military academy at West Point. You would think there probably had to be some interaction during the 2 years that Lee was at West Point. But again, out of all the voluminous correspondence from both of these men that survives, there's not a single letter. There's not a single recollection by somebody who saw both of them that they ever interacted or were aware of each other, even though they had to be aware of each other. And their personalities are radically different. I said Davis was sort of a frat boy when he was at West Point. He went through almost a 180-degree shift after the death of his first wife and became a somber, serious, seemingly humorless, punctilious Southern Democrat that we mostly know him as from his days during the Civil War. Lee operates, he thinks, on sort of a higher plane. He regards Davis and people like him as extremists who helped to bring on the war, which shows, parenthetically, that Lee is not all that politically savvy. Davis was not an extremist. He was reluctantly brought along by the extremists into secession and the war that followed. But to Lee, who's an upper class, upper South Whig, the people like these radical Democrats who are trying to bring about secession are all extremists. So there's just no basis for a relationship between these men at all. But then, in February of '61, the Confederate government is formed in Montgomery, Alabama. Jefferson Davis, who did not want the position, is chosen to be president, and he accepts it. And 5 days later, he sends a letter or telegram east of Virginia saying, "Where is Lee?" He knows he's going to want Lee in his army, probably because Lee had a tremendous reputation as an engineer, as an organizer, as a manager. He apparently is not thinking of Lee as a field commander at this point. Excuse me just a moment. White rum. But he knows he's going to need someone to help to organize this army he is going to have to build. As you know, Lee comes to Richmond initially as an advisor to Davis, not to be a field commander. At one point, he will be a sort of titular general-in-chief, though he never really exercises those functions. Still, in their early days together, looking at how do we build an army? How do we pull this together? What does the map look like? How do we contend with a force that's double our size, if not triple our size? How do we defend this long border from the Virginia coast to Texas and Mexico? And they begin to discover that they have some similarity in thinking in matters strategic. They both seem instinctively to realize that in a conflict, the underdog has got to take chances. They have to take risks. And with limited forces, they have to look at ways in which they can concentrate their forces against targets of opportunity to achieve the maximum result with the minimum of loss. Lee is more heavily involved in the planning for what becomes the first Manassas campaign than he's often given credit for. And Davis is heavily involved as well. It is they who craft and put together this concentration of the small armies of Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston to come together at Manassas miraculously, almost providentially, at exactly the right moment. Neither really gets credit for it afterward. Jefferson Davis never got over not getting credit for it. Lee, of course, stays silent, which would be perfectly in character with Lee. But they have learned that they think alike. Then comes, of course, Lee's unfortunate adventures out in West Virginia. I mean, West Virginia has a lot to answer for, but it almost eclipsed Robert E. Lee. And he was sent in to take over a poisoned command situation amongst 3 lesser commanders, whose names are, I prefer not to remember. He's not very successful there. He's then sent down to South Carolina, primarily as an engineer, to try to construct the defenses of Charleston and elsewhere to protect Charleston Harbor. Then he comes back as an advisor to Davis. And then suddenly we come to the Battle of Seven Pines in spring of '62. Joseph E. Johnston is commanding the Virginia Army then. It's not yet the Army of Northern Virginia. And what I would say is probably, from the Confederate point of view, the best bullet ever fired by a Yankee is the one that hit Joe Johnston and put him out of command. And suddenly there's this void. Lee and Davis are both on the scene. As I'm sure you know, Gustavus Smith initially rises into the command, but he has something akin to a nervous breakdown. The responsibility simply overwhelms him. And Davis puts the command temporarily in Lee's hands. And what happens? The first thing Lee does is say to the president, "What do you think we should do?" If you're a man with a tender, fragile ego like Jefferson Davis, imagine what that does for you. Joe Johnston would have said, "I'm going to do something, but I won't tell you what it is." Beauregard would say, "I'm going to do something," but he wouldn't do it. Lee is smart enough to read the president and to know that Davis wants to be involved. Davis flatters himself as a capable military commander, and indeed would rather have had a military command than the presidency. Lee knows that Davis has to be managed just as Davis has to manage Lee. And that first question sets the tone for a relationship that will become, in time, very, very good. Then, of course, comes the 7 days, Lee's successes. Then Lee's triumph at Second Manassas. And Davis begins to say to people in his circle, Lee rises to the occasion. Lee gave him respect, gave him a little bit of flattery, and he gave him victories. And when things went wrong, Lee took responsible for what happened rather than blaming someone else. You all know Joe Johnston, if anything went wrong, well, he did it. Lee will always take responsibility for what doesn't go well. Davis is pleased with Lee. So pleased indeed that when Lee proposes the first invasion of the North in the fall of '62, the so-called Antietam campaign, Davis is not very sure about it at first. It's a huge risk to take this army onto Northern territory, where who knows what could happen, where Union forces might concentrate on Lee, just as Confederate forces had concentrated on the Union Army at First Manassas. It was a huge risk, but again, they both realized we have to take risks and we have to use maximum force in a small space wherever we have an opportunity to make some kind of gains. And so Davis will say to Lee, "My confidence in you persuades me to allow you to go ahead." And what happens in that campaign really shows the pattern for this relationship, for the balance of the war, and especially how Lee so ably reads Davis's character and knows instinctively how to manage the president. He's been able to observe a lot from seeing what by this time is virtual war between Davis and Johnston and between Davis and Beauregard. It's a toxic relationship amongst the three. Well, there is no relationship among the three. And of course, it seriously compromises the ability of Confederate forces who are undermanned to achieve anything with what they've got. But observing this poisoned relationship with those generals, Lee is able, I think, to discern a little basic set of rules on how to get along with Davis and how to get from Davis what he needs to do his own job. And it's a good set of rules for a general in any time, in any place. Number one, take responsibility. Lee will always take to himself responsibility, even when it may not have been entirely his responsibility. Number two, keep the president informed. My God, the man is the commander-in-chief. He's entitled to information and he shouldn't have to ask for it. And yet he can never get a thing out of Johnston. He can never get a thing out of Beauregard. What he gets out of Braxton Bragg is mostly nonsense. Who was it? Richard McMurray, who some of you may know. He's a reputed Civil War historian. Used to wear a t-shirt that said, Braxton Bragg on the front. And on the back it said, it doesn't get any better. No, Braxton Bragg never did get better. Keep him informed. Lee will always keep Davis informed. Avoid the press. Good advice for everyone at any time. Don't talk to politicians. Also good advice. Lee once said, what is it? Politicians are the most incurable of all insane people. It's demonstrated every day in Washington. Don't challenge Davis or his friends or his cronies. And Davis is a man who's unfortunately very much allied to close friends. It's often been said that Davis was a better judge of his enemies than he was of his friends. And sometimes, sadly, that is the case. Be loyal. And don't get involved in command conspiracies. I'm sure you all know the pitiful state of the Army of Tennessee, out west of the Appalachians. One conspiracy after another, led by one inadequate general after another, dealing with a host of subordinates who are inadequate both as generals and as men, because their ambition is for themselves and not for their cause. Don't get involved in these internal little cabals. Well, Lee's perfectly suited to this. This is his natural personality and his natural inclination to begin with. So it's not a hard stretch for him to do this, as it would have been, say, for a number of other people who might have been in his position. And most of all, do something. Don't just say, I'm going to do something. Do it. When the Antietam campaign ended in defeat, well, it almost ended in the complete destruction of Lee's army. It came very close to it. If he hadn't been up against George Wavell's cat, but against a good general, he might have lost his army. The first thing Lee does is take responsibility for the failure at Antietam. There follows the Fredericksburg and the Chancellorsville campaigns, both wonderfully successful. And what does Lee do? He writes a letter to Davis every day, sometimes 2 letters, or a telegram, sometimes to say nothing more than, there is no news. But he understood the president stuck back in Richmond is hungry for information. He's entitled to information. And the more he knows, the more he can assist Lee in carrying out his duties in the front. And there's one other reason for all these letters as well. It keeps Davis in Richmond. Davis wanted to be at First Manassas, and as you know, he got there just as the battle closed. Davis wanted to be with Lee on the campaign into to Maryland in '62. No Army commander wants his commander-in-chief looking over his shoulder, interfering, or even just sort of being there. Lee has to pay attention to his mission. He can't pay attention to the care and feeding of a president. And Davis has repeatedly said, I want to come join you. I want to join you on the road into Maryland. And Lee's always writing back saying, it's far too dangerous, Mr. President. We can't afford to lose you. There are Yankee Raiders and all at large. It's simply too dangerous. And you are too needed in Richmond. And the combination of that, plus being informed, persuaded Davis reluctantly to stay in Richmond, where he, as commander-in-chief, belonged. It's the same with the Gettysburg campaign. And again, after the failure there, it's Lee who takes responsibility. He also offers to resign because of the defeat. By the way, it's worth pointing out that Lee never went into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, intending to stay there. This was always a raid. He was always going to come back to Virginia. So the fact that he retreats to Virginia shouldn't be a surprise. That's what he would have done anyhow. It's just that he had hoped to win a major victory on northern soil because of the diplomatic impact it might have. And that, of course, didn't happen. But from the Confederate point of view, the Gettysburg campaign is not a complete failure because it did draw troops away from Vicksburg. It did scare hell out of the Yankees in the north. Unfortunately, it also almost shattered Lee's command system. He takes responsibility and offers to resign, and Davis writes back to him saying, how can you ask me to replace you? who would I replace you with? There was no one who can replace you. And so Lee is secure in his command. The bond continues to grow closer as you get on into 1864. Once the army is tied up in the lines of Petersburg, there are almost daily encounters between them. Either Davis visits the army, or more often, Lee rides into Richmond to meet with Davis. By now, Davis's letters to a lot of his generals begin, "Dear General." His letters to Lee begin, "My dear friend." Lee is more than just his best general. Lee's kind of the rock on which Davis is clinging to keep trying to run the enterprise in front of him. Interestingly enough, when you read the correspondence, you will find that Lee is always subordinate to Davis. He will say such things as, "I defer to your superior wisdom on this issue. I would be happy to do whatever you think best. You know better than I." When I was in business, that was called sucking up. Now, you all know what sucking up is. I spent 30 years in executive management in the book and magazine publishing industry. I know sucking up when I see it, and when I did it. But there are two kinds. There's the kind done by, say, Judah Benjamin, or Lucius Northrop, designed to get something better for yourself, to get you in tighter with the president. And there's the other kind that Lee's practicing, which is the knowledge, that the admission, I'm dealing with a difficult personality who is under tremendous pressure. And if I make him feel better about himself, he will make it easier for me to do my job better, and it's a whole lot better to have him behind my bayonets rather than in front of them. And in that sense, Lee was a tremendous suck-up. And it was all to the good of getting his job done. He understood that his job was not to flatter his ego, it was to get the job done. By 1864, Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory, who kept a wonderful diary, recorded what Davis would say about Lee. When Davis spoke of Lee, Mallory wrote, all others were beginners. And from Davis's point of view, they were. In fall of 1863, and again in 1865, Davis tried to persuade Lee to go west and take command of that poor, beleaguered Army of Tennessee. You know, fine fighting men, a great army, just constantly stymied and stumbled over by a series of horrid commanders, more interested in boosting their egos, more interested in their conspiracies with each other than they were in doing their job. Lee rarely ever said no to Davis, but he did it in the fall of '63, after Missionary Ridge, when Bragg has to be relieved. And he'll do it again early in 1865, when Johnson is in command and things are pretty hopeless, which are always the case when Johnson's in command. I'm sorry to keep ragging on Joseph E. Johnson, but my God, what a deplorable human being. But I will give him credit. He wrote probably the greatest novel of the Civil War, which is his memoirs, because it's pure fiction. Davis tries again to persuade Lee in the spring of early '65 to take that command, and Lee refuses. And it shows the nature of this relationship, that Davis would take a refusal from Lee. And Lee, of course, was showing perfect sense. A, that was a poisoned command. He's highly unlikely to be able to do anything with it. And B, he knows Virginia. He knows the army that he has built, or he knows what's now left of the army that he had built. He is going to be far more effective in Virginia than he could ever have been out in Tennessee. I think Lee understood, nowhere does he say so, but I think it's kind of implicit, that at some point, that he understood before Davis did, that the game was going to be up. I would say somewhere in the fall of '64, of course he makes this comment, I think, to Jubal Early, that says if we get encircled by Grant at Petersburg, it's just a matter of time. You have to be careful with what Early says as well, but that was very much the case. Davis, of course, had what Lee called an almost supernatural confidence in ultimate success, showing that Lee did not have a supernatural confidence in ultimate success. And there are others, of course, who feel the same way as Lee, though they're more vocal. You know, there were never two political parties in the Confederacy. There was just the Jefferson-Davis Party and the anti-Jefferson-Davis Party, which had made up of disparate men. They really had nothing in common except that they all thought they should be president, and they hated Jefferson-Davis. And his personality was such that he instinctively just lit the fires under all of these people because of the way he had to have the last word. He had to impose his will on others. He really was not by nature cut out to be a chief executive, which I think he knew. By the fall of '64, people are suggesting people like the vice president, Alex Stevens, Robert Barnwell Redd of South Carolina, the self-proclaimed father of secession, Robert Toombs, first Secretary of State and then later a general in the Confederate Army, Louis Wigfall, who was once on Davis' staff. They're all saying Davis has got to be replaced by impeachment, if possible, by other means if necessary. Toombs will even suggest that perhaps Davis needs to be assassinated. I don't think it was a serious comment. Toombs was drunk half the time and said a lot of stuff that didn't really matter. But the point is there's a substantial group of these disaffected politicians who think Davis needs to be removed, and what do they want to do if they remove him? They want Lee to take over as dictator. The proposition is made by one of them, I'm sorry, I forget now, it's either Stevens or Toombs, to Lee, seeing if he would accept this kind of a command, this kind of a power, were it handed to him. We don't have any record of his response. I think, in fact, the letter that came to him, he simply never answered. Because Lee, among many other fine attributes, was a man who had word for word, letter for letter, respect for the Constitution. He would not do something that was unconstitutional, and that certainly included revolution. If Davis were impeached and removed from office, that at least would be constitutional. Lee will, however, have some interesting meetings with some others, not these disaffected opposition people, but some others who realized we're not going to win this. We need to see if we can find a way to make terms with the Yankees with as little loss to us as possible, perhaps, which could be things like retaining private property, soldiers being able to go home under arms to become state militia to help enforce law and order at home, because civil order has broken down in much of the Confederacy, especially west of the Appalachians. A number of other things that they hope, if we're willing to give up rather than force the North to defeat us in detail, we might get something back. And Lee has some meetings with these people, but then pulls out of it. We don't have enough information to know exactly the nature of it or why, except I think probably ultimately Lee regarded even that as being unconstitutional. He's a soldier who would do his duty, and his duty is to do what his commander-in-chief asks him to do. Davis never knew about this. And when Appomattox comes, Davis doesn't blame Lee at all. Lee takes responsibility. Davis essentially does his best to kind of absolve Lee of any responsibility for it. Ultimately, when they're together, taken together, I think the two make almost, given the fact that these are two imperfect men, they made an almost model commander-in-chief, general-in-chief relationship. It's primarily Lee who made it work. And I don't know that there have been many such relationships since. Grant and Lincoln, certainly. FDR and George Marshall, certainly. But it's an immensely difficult thing to take personalities like this in a time of crisis under all that pressure and have them work together as well as they did. Of course, you know, after the war, Davis is arrested and tried for treason, and no finding is ever handed down, and he's released. He and Lee only meet one more time. That's in Richmond in 1867, when Lee gave testimony prior to Davis's anticipated trial. The prosecution tried to maneuver Lee into assigning all responsibility for the war and its conduct on Davis. And Lee steadily said, "I am responsible for all that I did during the war." That's the last time Lee and Davis would ever see each other. And in that last moment, Lee was doing his best to protect, to look after Davis. You may have noticed that all the expressions of regard and so forth that I've mentioned came from Davis. Interestingly, perhaps significantly, we have almost nothing on which to base an opinion on how Lee felt about Davis as a man or as a president. If he ever uttered such an opinion, and it would have been uncharacteristic of him to do it, it hasn't come down to us. As I mentioned earlier, after the war, he did say to one interviewer that he thought before the war Davis had been one of the extremist politicians, which he was not. And he also would criticize Davis once for having a tendency toward controversy and hurting the cause by his inability to work with Johnston and Beauregard, which again showed Lee's failure to understand Joe Johnston at least. Beyond that, there's nothing. Lee may simply have been indulging his practice of not speaking ill of anyone, yet neither did he speak in praise of Davis. That in itself may be suggestive, for Lee rarely withheld praise. In the end, we can probably surmise that Lee never really felt that his relationship with Davis was anything more than a professional one. If so, as I said before, it was a magnificent working relationship. Lee was a better judgment of men than Davis. He read the president perfectly, and he knew precisely how to work with him by remaining subordinate at all times, and thus managing Davis instead of being managed by him. Davis gave Lee everything he asked for if it was in his power, and as a result, Lee gave Davis respect and victories. This was, in fact, a classic relationship of the kind. In 1863, writing to his brother Joseph, Jefferson Davis wrote, "A general in the full acceptation of the term occurs only once in a generation. In this great contest in which we are engaged, I have need of half a dozen." In the end, he only got one, Lee. Davis would spend most of the 3 years after his release abroad. He was just returning to the U.S. in the fall of 1870 when he learned of Lee's death. The effect of the news threw him into a depression, and for once in his rather verbose life, he was at a loss for words. "Lee was my friend," Davis wrote in his anguish, "and in that word is contained all that I could say of any man." Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for that insightful look at the relationship between Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. Now we're going to move on to the second portion of our program. Dr. Rob Havers, our president and CEO, is joining Dr. Davis up on the stage here, and they're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and then after that, they will open it up to the audience.
Kelly, thank you very much. Am I on, John? Am I on, John? Am I on yet, John? While we're fiddling with this, let me just say what a great turnout this evening. Fantastic, filled to capacity theatre, and a great speaker, so thank you all for being here this evening. I'm going to ask one or two questions, but I have no doubt in the audience are very many questions, so we will devote a fair bit of time to that. We can get our mics working. You can all hear me just sitting here. I may just ask a couple of questions while we're fiddling with the technology.
I'm fiddling with this cord. Last time I did this, my pants fell down.
So,
But you got to laugh.
if we need a laugh, I'll ask you to stand in a moment, and we're back on mic. Fantastic.
Yep, I think we're working.
Patience is a virtue indeed. A great exposition of the relationship between these two leaders. Did they ever disagree?
Certainly, they had open exchange of views and some disagreement over, as well as I said, for instance, the Antietam campaign and also the campaign into Gettysburg, into Pennsylvania. Some disagreement over, I guess, some uncertainty on Davis's part as to how great was the risk, and was the risk worth the potential benefit. But of course, Davis, as almost always, wound up giving in to Lee on it. They only had one serious disagreement that we know of, or that we think we know of. And this is a case where the sources are, we wish we had more. Charles Venable, who was on Lee's staff, wrote a letter in 1878 in which he described a moment in probably January of '65 Remember I said Davis is almost daily either visiting the Army or Lee's visiting Davis or communicating back and forth. And Davis had some issue, and Lee's getting pretty tired of this. He's got stuff to do on the lines of Petersburg. There was some minor matter of the destruction of civilian property or something like that, and Davis wanted Lee's input on this. And so he sent him a note asking him to come to Richmond to discuss it. Lee felt that he was too busy. And he wrote back saying, "I can't come, Mr. President, I am too busy here." And that just ticked off Davis, who was under tremendous pressure and probably didn't need Lee's counsel on this issue so much as he simply needed Lee in the same room with him to draw some strength from him. So Davis reacts like a 5 or 6 year old would in a similar situation. He sends back a stiff note saying, "Please know that you're further, something like, you disregard my previous note, please believe that your input will not be further," but he didn't use input. "I don't need to hear from you on this after all." And when Lee received this note, he realized, oh my God, I've offended the president. He immediately had travelers saddled and he came into Richmond, had a meeting with Davis. We don't know what took place. Lee comes back to the Army, apparently says nothing to anybody about this, but you can see in their correspondence that for several days thereafter, Davis's letters begin, "Dear General," instead of "My dear friend." But then they go back to "My dear friend." But we only have that one source for that, and it's 13 years after the fact, so it's anybody's guess if the guy here, Venable, got it right or not.
Wow, interesting stuff. You know what, why don't we take some questions from the floor? I'm sure it's going to be a forest of questions. Yes, sir, first one.
Dr. Davis, thank you. Great talk. I want to know, after the war, with Davis being incarcerated and then going to Europe, are there any surviving letters between the two?
Did everybody hear the question?
Yes.
No. No. I'm happy to be corrected if anybody knows, Graham or John, if you know, but I'm not aware of any post-war correspondence between them. Or if I've forgotten it if there was.
Yes, Jack.
Given the experience that Jefferson Davis, class of 28, West Point had in the Mexican War, subsequently Secretary of War, some people, in looking at his early command as Commander-in-Chief of a brand new army called the Confederate Army, trying to meld together all these different state regiments. A lot of historians have said, he had a better sense, Davis did, than Abe Lincoln might have had in pulling together regional relations, in managing regiments, which became brigades, which eventually became divisions. In all of the time you spent with Jeff Davis, was that an assistant to him in getting an army built, an army that he later, part of it in any case, he handed off to Robert Edward Lee?
I mean, there's no question that in 1861, there's nobody in the country, north or south, who has any experience of doing something like this. They're all earning while they learn and making big mistakes along the way. Davis, I think, deserves a great deal of credit, given that there's nothing in his background, as there was nothing in Lee's background, to even conceive of the scope of a million-man army, which is the Confederacy, almost enlisted over time, let alone the organization of it. Some of what Davis will do, as with Lincoln, is actually improvisational. Some is still sort of hidebound, like the business of state units or local units. They understand there's a good reason for that, local esprit, friends serving together. It's kind of a mutual loyalty and a mutual pressure to stand in the day of battle. I think Davis understood that probably better than Lincoln. It may have helped Lincoln because Lincoln was less hidebound by military experience than Davis was because of his time as Secretary of War. But people have made a lot, including probably me at some point, about Davis's experience as Secretary of War. Well, it was a big job because the Secretary of War handled about 90% of the federal budget. Because all we spent money on was forts and outposts and very little on anything else because the government wasn't involved in people's lives otherwise. But still, there was really, when you ask somebody who says Davis was a great Secretary of War, you then say, what did he do? And all they can remember is the camels. Call him the humpback of Notre Dame. So, I mean, Davis deserves a great deal of credit. I think, A, for the application to what he was doing. You know, if you called on him in his office in Montgomery in those early days, you would find him sitting at he had 3 offices. No matter where he was in his office. In his home, at the Capitol building, or in the War Department. He was always in the office, and he's sitting at a table with a stack of letters in one hand and fabric samples for Confederate uniforms in the other, because he's choosing the thread count of the fabric and the buttons to commission for this. He's doing everything by himself, with a very, very small staff of 2 or 3 people. It's inconceivable to us today. I mean, if Elon Musk had been alive, then there'd be nobody to fire.
Additional questions? Stephanie?
How did Davis react when Lee told him it was time to evacuate Richmond? Did he fight him on it, or did he just respect his opinion and tell him to evacuate? Or
The question is, how did Davis react when Lee told him they had to evacuate on April 2nd, 3rd? He didn't get back to me that I can recall. I mean, he took it as fact. I mean, Davis, sitting here in Richmond, he could hear the guns. He sort of knew they were out there someplace, over there, over there, over there. So there was no response from Davis. There's no substantive communication between the 2 of them after that. There's Lee sitting, notes back and forth, trying to get. But Davis and the cabinet, of course, are on the run heading down to Danville, so it's hard to get information back and forth. Lee is really pretty much cut off and on his own after they evacuate Petersburg.
yeah, they always say that he always felt like he was the president after Davis evacuated.
Well, he kind of was.
Yeah.
At least in that section of Virginia.
Yeah. Thanks.
Did Davis keep any kind of a daily journal or diary or something, talk about what he did and his conversations with his generals and that kind of thing?
The question is, did Davis keep a journal or diary? God, I wish he had. There's voluminous collections of Davis's letters, of course, hundreds, well, thousands of them from during the war period. But for a great deal of what he was thinking, we have nothing to go on except his semi-memoir, Rise and Fall of Confederate States Government, which is published 20 years later, and it's very defensive and not real reliable. One of Davis's first law of history is never trust a diary. Second law is never trust a memoir, because we always know that somebody's got to read them and we want to present ourselves in the best way we can. So diaries are really untrustworthy. But still, we would know so much more if he had. Davis is a writer, and he'll sit down and write a 10-page letter at the drop of a hat. But he didn't have the instincts, apparently, of a diarist or a journalist. I really wish he had.
Scott?
So during the debates in the Confederate government about recruiting enslaved Africans to serve in the military of the Confederate, what was Lee's position, and did he, I remember reading somewhere that he came around to supporting that. I was just wondering how those conversations may have occurred with Davis.
The question is about how did Lee come around to the proposal, or to signing on to the proposal to enlist blacks in the Confederate Army. He did come around to it. He was never an ardent supporter, but that's one instance in which, and Davis came around as well by 65 when it was too late to make any difference. So that's one area in which they may have had some disagreement earlier on, but they both came to be pretty much of one mind that this was a war necessity. However, I don't know that either of them ever thought it was really going to amount to anything.
Yes. Sir.
Hello, Dr. Davis. I just want to say I enjoyed your books and seeing you speak on different documentaries, although your hair was a little darker back but
Yeah, it's still there, it's still mine.
yeah, well, you got me there. I've got two questions. One, okay, had Sidney Johnson survived Shiloh, would Davis have brought him back to Virginia as opposed to having Lee command? And two, my second question goes back to something that you wrote in one of your books and when you just spoke, which is in which you said that Lee respected the Constitution, and all these people who were conspiring to replace Davis wanted him as dictator. However, in order for him to be in that position, he had to go against the first Constitution that he had sworn allegiance to, that of the U.S. Army. Okay, how is that not contradictory?
Well, you know, both constitutions are almost word for word the same, except for the provisions dealing with slavery and slavery in the territories that are engraved in the Confederate Constitution, whereas they're not in the original U.S. Constitution. But Lee was not going to countenance the business of replacing Davis extra legally. So I don't think there's a conflict for him because he's not going to do something that's against the Constitution. The Albert Sidney Johnson question is to me, one of the most fascinating when you deal with Jefferson Davis. Johnston was the beau ideal of all the cadets at West Point when Davis was there. Johnston was tall, good-looking, dignified, suave, came from an old Kentucky blood, and further east of the South before then. Everybody wanted to be part of what his clique, or as they called him then, his set. And Leonidas Polk was part of that set, which shows that Johnston's judgment wasn't very good. And for whatever reason we don't know, Johnston invited Davis to become a member of his set. It was kind of like Frank Sinatra inviting Dean Martin to be part of the Rat Pack. And I don't think Davis ever got over that. He was so flattered and so chuffed up by being included in that set that he almost idolized Sidney Johnston. Again, I've talked about how there's no correspondence between Lee and Davis really up until 1861. Davis will talk in later years about his closest friend, his idol, Albert Sidney Johnson. You can't find a single letter between them from 1828 until the war, even during the war with Mexico. So where is this intimate friendship when they haven't been in touch for 30 years? But that is because of that he makes Johnston his premier army commander. You know, Johnston's the second-ranking general. Samuel Cooper is the first-ranking general. He's Secretary of Richmond. And Johnston is the lead field commander. I think it's highly unlikely that Davis would have brought him east to Virginia solely because Johnston was dealing with this vast territory from Kentucky at one point all the way down through Mississippi, and he went even into parts of Louisiana. And my suspicion is that Davis would have left him there. The interesting thing is, what would Sidney Johnson have amounted to if he had survived Shiloh? Because we have no way of telling what kind of field commander he was going to be because he was only in command for half a day.
Question over there, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to push back a little bit on your conclusion that this relationship was comparable to Lincoln and Grant or Marshall.
If you're going to argue with me, I'm going to leave.
So you said a general in chief, but of course Lee didn't become a general in chief until very end of the war. I think it's symbolic of the fact that I think you've shown that Lee managed Davis very well, and he drove the slave in listening to the slave scheme, and Davis came around because Lee was in favor of it. While Pat Claiborne, if we may stand up for a general in the Army of Tennessee, was pretty much blackballed because he 10 months before he said the same thing and just was told to shut up about it. But Davis didn't really manage his generals very well. He should have made Lee a general in chief or had a general in chief. That Lee was too focused on Virginia and he's commanding the Army of Northern Virginia. And so therefore, just as we can condemn Davis for his poor relationship with Johnson and Bragg and all the rest of it, we could condemn him for that too, of not thinking of putting Lee in kind of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What was his question?
The question is, I want to repeat that.
Basically, the relationship between Lee and Davis is not the same as between Grant and Lincoln and or FDR and Marshall because they kind of managed each other. Lee managed Davis is the story I'm getting. Davis didn't really manage Lee. at all,
Mhm.
by keeping the focus on Virginia, and not making the general-in-chief until, what, February '65, very, March?
The
Very
appointment was
late.
made in January, and he takes it over in
Yeah,
early February.
yeah.
Yeah. There's this question of Davis making Lee general-in-chief. Why didn't he do it sooner? I can't really answer that, except that I know Lee was pretty resistant to it. Because, as I think I said, he knew Virginia, he knew this army he had built, and he didn't want to have to bother with what's going on out in the West. I think Davis never explicitly said so, but I think one of the reasons he finally made Lee general-in-chief was so that he could turn the Joe Johnston problem over to Lee to handle. Because Davis is not always a self-aware man, but he certainly knew he could not handle Johnston. And Lee and Johnston are Virginians. They had been at the West Point at the same time. He had they were friends of a sort. I think he had some hope that Lee could get from Johnston what Davis could not. Johnston wouldn't communicate with Davis. Maybe Lee could get him to communicate with him. The war didn't go on long enough for us to see if that was going to work out or not. And it's hard for Davis to give up power. Not that he's power hungry, but he feels a personal responsibility for the whole Confederacy and what happens to it. That's one of the reasons I think he probably never could have countenanced trying to sue for peace terms with the North on some basis short of defeat. Because, Davis is a man who has 4 sons and he outlives all 4 of them. I think the Confederacy to Davis is tantamount to another son. How can he willingly oversee the death of his son? And so it was hard for him to turn over power because I don't think he trusted anyone's judgment except Lee's, perhaps. That's kind of a wandering answer to your question, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
You talk about follow-up on the mismanagement of generals by Davis. Would you say the mismanagement of, what general would you say is the general he mismanaged the most? Is it Bragg?
Which general did Davis mismanage the most?
Yes, sir.
He's got a lot of bad generals.
Right.
Some of them are just bad on their own without needing Davis to interfere to make things worse. The ones he does not manage well are Johnston above all, Beauregard. He manages Braxton Bragg pretty well. He's just not wise in keeping Bragg in command as long as he did. So it's easy to dump on Braxton Bragg, but keep in mind that Braxton Bragg will launch more offensives than any other Confederate Army commander except Lee. So what does that say about the other Confederate Army commanders? Now, his campaigns, except for Chickamauga, all fall apart because he can't manage his army. But the fact is, he at least was willing to take a chance. He's willing to fight. He just does not have the personality to develop the loyalty and esprit that he requires from his subordinates. Davis interferes the most with the generals he trusts the least, and that's Johnston and Beauregard. There are probably a few others, but they're the ones who always stand out.
I apologize to ask a follow-up. In '64, when Beauregard seems to do better, does that cause him to rise up in the eyes of?
You kind of have hope that it will,
Right.
but it doesn't last,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Boys.
Who's this fella here?
We let anyone in these days.
If he had a bow tie, I'd take his question.
Jack, in your great book on Lee and Grant, you did a terrific job of talking about Lee's evolution in his religious beliefs. Was there anything in the religious beliefs of Lee and Davis that came up at all? I mean, was it relevant at all?
That's a great question. Lee is what would be called a providentialist. God manages everything. Men have very little control over what happens. So if God wills that we win our independence, we will. If he wills that we don't, we won't. That's pretty much been that. By the time the war comes, Lee is thoroughly into that mold of mind. It's interesting to note that as a convenient religious attitude for an army commander.
Yeah.
If the battle's lost, it's not my fault. God didn't want us to win. That's cynical. I don't think Lee was that cynical. But there's kind of a bit of that there. When it comes to emancipation or abolition, Lee will say, slavery is an evil, but man cannot eradicate it, only God can eradicate it, which means it can never be eradicated. Davis is religious, he's an Episcopalian, but his religious notions are far harder, I think, to discern. He hardly ever talks about it. He will speak of the dispensations of the Almighty and that sort of thing. But I don't recall any instance in which what we can glean about Davis's religious feelings either gel with or contrast with Lee's.
Thank you.
Angela.
It's probably not easiest thing to answer quickly, but who do you think had worse troubles with managing their generals, Lincoln or Davis?
Lincoln had more bad ones to deal with in the first half of the war, but he got rid of them. You know, by 1864, you don't have McClernand or McDowell or McClellan in the North. By 1864, you've still got Joe Johnston and Gus Beauregard. So, but Davis has fewer people to choose from. In a way, Davis kind of hamstrung himself with the Army organization he came up with by creating these 4 levels of generalship, you know, brigadier, major, lieutenant general, and full general, and appointing, I forgot now, it's 7 or 8 full generals. So he made it, I don't know why he did this, but he made it difficult to replace one of those full generals because he didn't have any other spares. So when he gets rid of Joe Johnston temporarily and promotes Hood, he makes Hood temporarily a full general. It's a somewhat awkward command structure that makes it's less fluid, less plastic than is the command structure in the Union. And also Lincoln has the benefit of, by 64, being able to turn this over to Grant, which Davis could never do. You didn't ask my opinion, but I'll give it anyhow, so you're stuck with it. To me, Grant is the most interesting man of the war, and the most underrated. How he grew, how he developed, how a guy who starts out commanding a little Illinois regiment of ruffians and scapegraces has the opportunity to grow from regimental command to brigade to a division to a small theater command to a bigger theater command. He comments on this himself. He had the benefit of being able to have an education at each succeeding level of command before he had to take over the big one. Lee didn't have that benefit. And Johnston and Beauregard didn't have that benefit. They started out at the top. And you know, it's pretty tough at the top if you don't have this education to get to it. If anybody reads my book on Lee and Grant, you will probably be able to tell that I find Grant more interesting. That's not to denigrate Lee at all. But you know, I was once asked someplace, who would I like to have dinner with, Lee or Grant? And I thought about that for a while, and I realized if I had dinner with Robert E. Lee, when the dinner was over, I'd go home and I'd say, well, I had dinner with Robert E. Lee. If I had dinner with U.S. Grant, I went home, I'd say, I got to know Grant a little. There's a big difference. Lee is, people have referred to some of his own friends referred to Jefferson Davis as the Sphinx of the Confederacy, a strangely muffled man. And Lee is muffled in many ways. I think that rigid sense of duty, the sense of how he was supposed to act and conduct himself as one of the FFVs, as a man who commanded the army. He had all this responsibility on him, and one of his ways of dealing with it was to contain himself within himself. Grant is really kind of out there to sea. And I got to be friends with his grandson, Chapman Grant, so I'm that
Yes, sir.
Yes, again, we certainly enjoyed your erudition, but Lee must have understood that victory was impossible. Do you have a sense of when that occurred and was he able to convey that feeling to Jefferson Davis?
The question is, the statement in question was that Lee must at some point have realized that victory was impossible, and at what point did he convey that to Davis, if he did? Is that a fair statement? I don't think Lee regarded, keep in mind, people always say, what could the Confederacy have done to win? What if Lee had stood on his head at Gettysburg? What if? they tend to forget that there's 2 million men in a Union Army and a whole lot of good generals against them. I don't think there was ever a point in the war when there's something the Confederacy could have done to win its independence. But every day of that war, Lincoln could have decided to lose, and didn't. So I don't think Lee would have gone into the North in Pennsylvania in '63 if he didn't think there was a point in it. If he thought they were going to lose then, I doubt that he'd have wasted the manpower in an army to which he was very emotionally attached. As I think I said, and this is just from inductive reasoning, there's nothing I can point to prove this, that it's late fall, early winter of '64, '65, that Lee probably realizes we're not going to win this. And from that point on, I think he's operating chiefly out of a sense of duty. And I think I did mention a little bit more about this. There was this group formed in Richmond, and I've forgotten the name of the man who hosted it now, but some Confederate officials, Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge is one of them, a couple of congressmen, Senator George Vest from Missouri, several other senators, who get together clandestinely to talk about how can we maneuver President Davis into accepting a negotiated settlement if the Yankees will give us one. We won't be able to keep our enslaved people. Slavery's dead. But we might be able to keep our property. We might not have our leaders tried for treason. We might be able to maintain our civil institutions as they are. As long as we can cost the Yankees blood and treasure, we still have something to bargain with, even if it's not a lot. And multiple meetings take place from January really through March, really right up to the evacuation. They enlist Wigfall, Stevens to some extent, and Lee takes part in a few of these meetings. We don't know what goes on, but we know Lee met with them. And the plan some had was that if Lee will provide we will have the Secretary of War request from Lee a statement of our current condition and the possibilities or probabilities of future success. The theory was if Lee would then provide to them a woeful statement of how deplorable things were and they had no chance, that might be enough to persuade Davis to open negotiations, especially if they get it in the newspapers first. So, and that was what Lee was to do. But what he did was, I think, he simply couldn't bring himself to do that in the end. So what he provided was nothing like what this group of people were looking for. But so right up to the evacuation of Richmond, there was, well, indeed during the fight of the Confederate cabinet, people are still politicking with Davis, trying to get him to give up so that they can bargain for something. When they've all captured, the government's dispersed. The only free member of the government is the Secretary of War, who escapes to Cuba. And he plans to go from Cuba to Texas because Kirby Smith still has an army there. So there's still a Confederate army in the field, which means there's something to bargain with to try to get something other than a demand for unconditional surrender. So Lee has his nose in that a little bit, but then pulls away. I wish we knew more about it, but the sources just aren't there.
Yes.
So I had a question. I've always, I read a few things that talk about Verena Davis, Jefferson's wife, and her thoughts on Lee versus Johnston. And I've read some things that she preferred Johnston in command. I don't know if it was over her friendship with his wife. I think her name was Lydia. I don't remember. So is there anything, like, insight that you have on that about her opinion of those two men, Lee versus Johnston?
Wow. The question is, what was the opinion of Jefferson Davis's wife, Verena, of Joe Johnston? If I ever knew it, I'm sorry, I've forgotten. She's a fascinating character.
Yes.
I think she's probably sharper than her husband.
Yes.
I think she's more self-aware than her husband, and I think she has an honest insight into both his strengths and his failings, whereas he is not an introspective man and is not all that self-aware. Verena is well worth your reading and study. She's a pretty sharp character. In some ways, she's a 20th century woman, I think.
Yes, sir.
You had mentioned Lee's rule against cabals, and to his generation, the American Revolution wasn't that far in the past. His father had served under Washington, and there was a major plot against Washington to replace him. I'm just curious if some of that carried over from his father's experience.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. You're referring to the Conway cabal.
Right.
In which there's some people plotting to take the command away from Washington. And certainly, Light Horse Harry would have known about that when it became public knowledge. He wasn't involved in it, of course. But you may very well be right that Lee's attitude toward that could have been colored by what he had seen happen in the Revolution, particularly since Lee, I've never really seen a statement by Lee that he identifies himself with Washington, but so many people say he did, that perhaps he did. But certainly he's well aware of what was going on with that plot. And there were one or two other much lesser ones, not to displace Washington, but inter-command rivalries to get somebody promoted over somebody else. I think he found that sort of thing utterly distasteful and ungentlemanly, unsoldierly. It's simply not what a man, a real man, would do.
Probably have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
I find it interesting that as close as they were during the Civil War, that Lee and Davis had very little contact, given there was 5 years of life left there. Can you offer an explanation why that never happened?
Well, part of it, of course, is Lee only lives 5 years after the war. Secondly, Davis is imprisoned almost, immediately. He's captured May 10th, and he's not released until, I forget when, is it 1867?
2 years.
Lee goes home to Lexington and really kind of wants to be forgotten. Lee doesn't really get involved with things like Confederate history, like trying to defend. He does become defensive in his last years and starts collecting materials to write not a memoir but a history of his army, largely designed to prove that he was always outnumbered, which he usually was, but not to point fingers at other generals, that sort of thing. Other than that one time that they're in the same courtroom in 1867, there's nothing further between them that has survived. It's always possible that Lee may have had letters from Davis, or Davis had letters from Lee that were lost or destroyed, but I'm inclined to think probably not. But which again goes to my point, I think, that theirs is a wartime military-civilian relationship that doesn't really have a basis for a lifetime personal friendship.
Jack Davis, thank you very much.
Thank you all. It's been great time.
As always, I will echo what Kelly said. A lot of people in this room this evening with tags on saying member, thank you for your support. If you are not yet a member, tonight is a fantastic night to become a member. You can join at the front desk. If you become a member tonight, we will extend another invitation for Jack Davis to come back and do an encore presentation. This is a great crowd tonight. Thank you so much. Jack Davis, thank you once again. Thank you.